welcome everyone. My name is Katie John. I'm an application engineer at the ETIS Foundation, and welcome to our third in a series of o²S²PARC webinars. Today, we're going to be talking about packaging your code and turning it into a module on o²S²PARC so it can be shared and executed directly from the browser. Right. Our goal for this webinar is to teach you how you can submit your code so that it can be run on o²S²PARC. Now, there are a few requirements concerning code organization, the metadata that we'll need, and the submission process. But hopefully, you'll find these to be relatively straightforward and painless. Once your code is onboarded onto o²S²PARC, ideally, it will be usable by anyone with a web browser and even those with no coding background whatsoever. Now, just in case there's someone here who is new to o²S²PARC, I'm going to quickly go through the user interface. Here, the dashboard is essentially your home page on o²S²PARC. There are three tabs here. There's the Studies tab, the Discover, and the Data tab. And the Studies tab, what you're going to see are a bunch of tiles where you can go into each of your studies, which is the same thing as an o²S²PARC project. Now, clicking on one of these tags, the empty study will create a new study that has nothing inside of it. And so if you are to click in this empty space where it says double click, you're going to see something called the service catalog, which shows you a bunch of different little cards that you can add to your study. Now, if you do that, that will add that node into your new project. And if you double click within this, you're going to enter the user interface of that specific node. Here, you're going to see a bunch of parameters that the submitter has given you access to, as well as a little bit of information about each of those things. Now, these nodes are what we're going to be focused on today. There are two types of nodes in o²S²PARC. There's computational and interactive. Computational ones, like the one that you just saw, has a pretty limited user interface. It has usually a list of parameters that you can set and some information about those parameters as a tooltip. Once those parameters are set, you can just run the node, and then you don't really have to do anything. You just wait until it's finished. Now, the interactive nodes are generally have a bit more of a complex interface and require some user interaction to perform these tasks. So for example, what I have here is a Jupyter Math node. And when you enter it, you have a complete Jupyter Lab interface where you can script directly on o²S²PARC. And so this is something that you cannot just run and wait till it's finished. It's something that you're continuously interacting with, hence the name. For the purposes of this webinar, we're going to be focused on the computational ones. And for the moment, we don't have custom GUIs that can be supported. So if you have a custom GUI for your code, we can't quite put that in o²S²PARC yet. But this is something that we're working on continuously, and hopefully we'll have that up for you in the near future. So before I start telling you how you can submit your code to be turned into a computational node, it's just good to go over maybe why you might want to do that. Besides, well, why wouldn't you want to do that? But anyway, so if you want to put your code in a way that is accessible by other people, you can share your executable code with some sort of access filter. So you can choose who can look at it and who can run it. And it's also easy to use. So if you put your code as a computational node on o²S²PARC, anyone who has access to the o²S²PARC platform can run it directly just like that without having to download your code, installing its dependencies or anything like that. So it's fairly straightforward for them to run your code. Next, there's a parameter exposure, which means that you can set what types of inputs that users will see and what they can edit. So that list of parameters that you saw in those two examples before, those are things that you will be able to define when you submit your code to o²S²PARC. And this could be really useful. For example, if you're in the pre-publication phase, you haven't quite published your paper on it yet, but you still want people to be able to use your code without looking in the guts of it. So this is something that scientists might be interested in as a feature of a computational node. Now, just to say, if you aren't interested in a computational node where you have to submit it to us and we package it up for you, what you can always do is go to a sandbox style like the Jupyter Math that you saw before, where you can script directly on the o²SPARC interface. And this is something that you don't need to submit to us. You can do whatever you want directly on there. Now onto the submission requirements. To put your code inside a node, we have ported many different kinds. And what we really need from you are first the source code, the code itself. We can't read your mind, unfortunately, yet. The metadata concerning how you can get it to run. So basically the ways that you would have to tell someone to get it working on their computer. Now, the validation data is necessary so that we can test that once we have your code, whether that it runs the same way for us as it does for you. Next, for the user metadata is basically what the user sees. So for example, the input and output parameters, what should they do with those? How can they edit them? And what does it mean when they change a certain parameter? For the code itself, there, as I said, quite a few different languages that we have onboarded so far. If your code is an interpreted language like MATLAB or Python, you can give us directly the code files. If it needs to be compiled, you can give us the binaries or the executables. We also accept Docker images. So if you're using Docker already, you can send that to us too. To actually send us the code, what we generally prefer is a version repository. And this way we can keep track of what version of the code we have. And that way, if you update your code, we can make a new version on our side for it as well. The repository can be in GitHub because that's the most popular repository platform that there is, but we also accept other ones such as Bitbucket or SourceForge. If you don't have it in a code repository, then what you can do is also submit it in a zip file, which will be attached to your submission form. And I'll get to the submission form a little bit later, but essentially we have a submission form on the o²SPARC platform, which you're going to be using if you want to be submitting code to us. Now for the metadata and validation data, we will need a bunch of different information depending on the type of code that you're submitting. For interpreted languages like MATLAB and Python, we'll need the version of each of those you're using and whatever dependencies you have, such as additional modules for Python or toolboxes for MATLAB. For binaries and executables, we'll need to know the native OS of where those were compiled in and any other libraries that they might depend on. We'll also need to know how to run your code. So through a command line interface, a text interface to run the command that's going to execute your code. To make sure that your code is running properly as a node on our side, we're going to need some validation data. So essentially, if you're running the code with the X inputs and you get Y as an output, we should be able to get the same. So we're going to need some of that information in order to make sure that when we've converted it into a node on our side, that it's doing what you think it should do. So preferably these metadata and the validation files will be attached to the repository or the .zip file along with your code submission. So what we have currently supported are several different languages, Python 3 and MATLAB, and we also have a few C++ ones. Executables that we support right now are only those that were compiled with a Linux OS. And dependencies of those code should be installable on a Linux machine. If you're going to be submitting a Docker image, ideally it has a Linux base. Now, that said, if your submission doesn't fall under one of these categories, we can discuss about different options to onboard it. So this is not something like So we want to work with you if you have code that doesn't fall into one of these categories. For user metadata, we also need to have a few bits of information. First off, we need to have your name and contact information so that everyone can know what a great job that you did. Also, we'll need a description about the code to let users know what the code submission is supposed to do. A user will also need to know how to run your resultant node and what they can do to tinker with it. So for this, we'll have a variable name for each input or output. And the inputs need to be consistent with the command line interface commands that you're going to provide to us. We'll also need to know the type of variable that it is, for example, a CSV file or an integer. Also the name of the variable that the user sees, which can be a string. It can be longer, for example, than the name of the variable. And the default value, if you have any units of measure of the input or output, again, if there is any, and also a description of what the input or output variable represents. So since that, we've noticed that most submissions that we've received so far have been either Python or MATLAB, we decided to dedicate a section of this webinar to show you how we would like you to organize your code in these two languages if you're going to submit it to o²S²PARC. Now, before you get scared, these organizational tips are probably something that you already have used or are using currently. So nothing crazy. For Python and MATLAB, we require something, main function, a single entry point for your code submission. So this main function can call as many other functions as you want, but it has to handle all of the inputs that are going to go inside of your code. In addition to this, we're going to need a command line interface to execute your code. For MATLAB, it's going to be compiled, and then that dedicated compiler is going to create a default command line interface. So you won't have to necessarily worry about that. For Python, there are several different options for your main function and how to handle the command line inputs. Here, I just list a few of these ways, but you can choose your own preference. Here, I'm going to give you a few examples of main functions. In both MATLAB and Python, the function is going to call other functions. The MATLAB main here calls hello world and passes its input. In Python, the main function calls the process data function. Both of these called functions don't get any inputs other than from the main function. So that's how we're going to need it to be structured for an o²S²PARC submission. Next, I show you an example of command line interfaces. So for the MATLAB example, as I mentioned, the compiler is going to enforce a specific command line interface. If you have a function such as this, where it's going to create a magic square with the dimension that you put in as an input, once you compile it with MCC, you're going to get an executable, and each of the inputs is going to be tacked on like this. So in order to pass inputs, you just call the executable and then the input. And the result of that execution is going to be an n by n matrix. For the Python example, what you can do is add arguments inside your code to handle each of the ones that are going to be passed through the command line. So when your command line interface looks like this, when you pass in this one input, it's going to know how to parse that out. Again, you can use any Python argument parsing technique that you want. These are just examples for good practices. So now you're probably wondering, well, that was a lot of information. Can I finally submit my code to o²S²PARC? And the answer is yes, you can. And in order to do that, I mentioned a submission form, and this is accessible by the Discover tab. When you log into o²S²PARC and you go to the dashboard, go to the Discover tab, and then under the services section, you're going to see Submit New Service button. And then if you click on that button, you'll be able to access the submission form. So here, Discover, the top is going to be the templates section. The second is going to be the services. Click Submit New Service, and this is where you will access this submission form with the information that I mentioned. And as I said, for the validation data and for the code metadata, it'd be great if, however you're submitting it, those things are attached with your code. So just a quick recap of everything that I've went through so far. First, how are you going to format your code? If it's an interpreted language, it needs to have a main function which takes in all the inputs. And then if you have other functions that you need to call, it'll call them. Next, you're going to have to provide your source code and validation data and code metadata with some repository or through a zip folder that is submitted through the submission form. Next, you're going to fill out the submission form with your contact information, some code metadata like the description of what it does, how other people can access your code. If there's a link, then the validation data to make sure that we can get it to work, and user metadata so that people know how they're going to be able to mess with the inputs and what outputs they should be getting. After you're done, click submit, and then we'll contact you. We'll let you know either if we have some questions about running your code, or maybe it's already ready to test on the o²S²PARC platform, and then we'll have you test it before it can be made available to other people. Just as a bonus, perhaps you want to let your users know how far your code has progressed. And for this, all you need to do is add a print or standard output statement to your code with the progress, either the percentage or a fraction or a decimal. Any of these formats will work. So it has to be in some format, progress, colon, and then the number. And we can process a number of different types of numbers after that. And this is something that can be used for example, simulations where you have a simulation time. For example, if your simulation time is 100 seconds, and then you would know after, for example, 25 seconds, 50 seconds, 75 seconds, you can add a print statement, and then this bar will accrue as that code is running. And this is just a nice touch for your eventual users so that they can see how much has progressed and perhaps how much longer they can expect to wait before your computation is done. Great, with that, I am finished with most of the content. And here is just a list of the resources that you have available to you. If you have any questions, you can email us at support@o²S²PARC.io. We have our documentation website at docs.o²S²PARC.io. And if you want to take a look at our source code, o²S²PARC is of course open source. So you can find us at github.com/ethysfoundation/o²SparC support. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, now would be a great time, or just expressions of glee.
Hey, Kathy, this is Bhavesh.
Hello.
Hey, I was wondering, you know, with the specific organization that we have to do for the code, would the same code run on a, you know, on a local computer, or would we have to provide a different version or have some specific structuring to make sure it runs on both o²S²PARC, but also on a computer if user decides to run it that way?
So there's no direct way to run an o²S²PARC node on a local computer. I suppose the public ones are in Docker images that are in our Docker hub, the Docker hub. So that is something that you can bring to a local computer.
I meant the source code file itself. Let's say I have a Python code file, and not the node, but just the code file. Would that be interoperable between o²SPARC and a local computer and so on?
Yes. So sure. Okay. The only caveat is, for example, if that local computer doesn't have all of the dependencies, then it won't run. But assuming that all the dependencies are there, the version of Python is the same, then there's no difference. It's basically the Docker container that we use is essentially a virtual machine based in Linux, and so it should be the same.
If I may ask another question, I was wondering if this submission of the code is part of the curation process, or do we submit that separately whenever it's ready, or is there at some time point where is that kind of all linked together, or do we necessarily need to have a data set submitted and the code with that data set or have it approved by the curation team before we submit it on o²SPARC? Or so just kind of the process for submitting.
Sure. So this is a great question, and it's something that we still kind of need to work out with the curation team, in fact. So we're in ongoing discussions about this. I think ultimately these two things are going to run in parallel. So we will be responsible for code submissions, but we have yet to define what we call a computational minimal information standard. And basically that's the minimal metadata that you must submit so that it fulfills our criteria. And we don't have that outlined yet. So for right now, if you want to submit your code, you can submit it directly to us. There doesn't have to be a data set. Of course, if you have data, so not code data, but data, this will still have to go through the curation team. And if, for example, you have data with accompanying code, the curation team will send that code to us in order for us to see if that can be uploaded onto o²SPARC.
Okay, that makes sense. So I think just the simplest way would be to include it in our data set, submit it for review to the curation team, and then they will reach out to you, and I guess you guys will reach out to us to work together to put it on o²SPARC.
So yeah, that I suppose it depends on what kind of code that you have, but yes, that should work. The submission form fills out a lot of things for us that I'm not sure that the curation team asks for. So I think that the curation team for right now just asks your code to be inside a code folder, whereas in order to turn it into a computational node on o²SPARC, it's going to require these other things that I presented. So it's not just put it in that folder and then boom, done.
Yeah. Okay. Could there be anything, we have like a data set description form and a submission form, or that's an Excel sheet that we include with the data set. Would there be at some point something similar that we have to include specifically in the code folder that include all the information you would need, which would make things maybe easier?
Yeah, so this is, as I said, we're still in ongoing work with the curation team in order to figure this out. But this is a really good point, and I will jot it down so that for our next meeting I can bring that up with everyone. We don't have that in place yet, and we didn't really talk about it, but that is a really good point that maybe it would be easier for submitters if it worked that way.
Thank you so much.
And I thank you all for your attention, and I wish you a good day, evening, morning, wherever in the world you might be.